Hello everyone, this is Sarah Serluco, and this is my presentation on homeless youth here in Atlanta. I hope you enjoy it, and thank you for taking the time to listen. When I think of homeless kids, I picture dirty, tattered, dressed, dark-faced children digging through dumps or begging for money. Those commercials on TV that ask us for $1 a day or whatever we can give. And I picture those kids, and I think of other faraway countries. I picture that movie Slumdog Millionaire. But when I try to picture in my mind the homeless youth in America, I really don't have a clear picture of what that looks like. And maybe it's the same for many of you. We see homeless adults here in Atlanta every day, and we see men, mostly African American men, sleeping under a highway overpass, under a pile of blankets. And it's a real recognizable image. We can see it and we can identify it. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution did an article in 2011 on the various agencies tapped by the state of Georgia to take to the streets in Atlanta and try to actually count the homeless youth. And to achieve a real number, they reported, could very well be elusive. They called it hiding in plain sight, because the homeless youth in Atlanta is not something we see every day on our ride home from work or school or on our TV. They don't stand out, the AJC reporter said. They look like ordinary teenagers, hanging out at libraries and at the malls. Not exactly what you would think. According to the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention in the U.S. Department of Justice, close to 1.7 million homeless and runaway youth are in the United States. This number is equal among men as it is among women, and with the majority age being 15 to 17 years old. In Atlanta, there are reported figures of approximately 2,500 homeless children on any given night from all ages and backgrounds, white, black, and Latino. Their situations are so bad that their only option is to live on the street. The kids have suffered physical and sexual abuse at home, perpetrated by their own parents or guardians. Young girls have become pregnant with few options and no support. They have been sexually exploited by child traffickers. Drug addiction and alcohol abuse of their family members has led to parental neglect, and they are at risk if they continue to stay at home. They may have been put out due to their sexual orientation. The young lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community is the largest growing population of homeless youth here in Atlanta. And the young people may first become homeless with their families due to financial crisis, which results in the loss of their housing. It may also be due to limited employment opportunities for their families, which offer low wages, no health care, may limit welfare benefits. And the kids may later become separated from the rest of the family in shelters and transitional housings, or become part of the foster care system. Young people coming out of the foster care system, as our friend Lauren Manning has told us, often find themselves homeless. One national study reported that more than 1 in 5 youth who arrived at shelters came directly from foster care, and that more than 1 in 4 had been in foster care in that previous year. Homeless youth find themselves with additional challenges than other homeless populations. There's a lack of beds, and the policies in many shelters keep them from adequate housing. Their age keeps them from working and making any money to use for their basic needs. Some have to sell themselves for sex in exchange for food, clothing, and shelter. And without an address and a legal guardianship, they can't go to school. The U.S. Department of Education reported in a study from 2012 that there are 1 million homeless students in the U.S., and this rose 57% since the year 2007. They attribute that to the Great Recession. They can only compile the report based on those that are registered homeless through their school, leaving you to think how many more homeless children are living on the streets without getting an education. The McKinney-Vento Act is a federal law designed to ensure that homeless children have equal access to an education. And in my current placement for my internship, I work with many families who are homeless and live with friends or family out of the school zone, but by law, the school must arrange transportation for these kids who are classified homeless. So they are kids from all races and ages, but primarily those who have already been living in poverty, abused, beaten, exploited, trafficked, neglected. They have all experienced something traumatic that has left them completely alone. I would imagine it would be hard to count the homeless youth if you have trouble identifying them. And to count them, we must define who they are. This is so important because we cannot help these kids if our policymakers and advocates are unable to agree on how to identify them. When classifying them in Georgia, we call someone who is homeless, it would be any person or family who has no access or reasonably expected not to have access to either traditional or permanent housing, which can be considered safe, sanitary, decent, and affordable. There seems to be 3 ways I found that gives us definition on homeless youth here in Georgia. And the Governor's Office for Children and Families report says the definition of a homeless youth varies based on the circumstances surrounding their housing status and accompaniment by a parent or caregiver. And according to the Federal Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, homeless youth are individuals, quote, not more than 21 years of age for whom it is not possible to live in a safe environment with a relative and who have no other safe alternative living arrangement. In contrast, the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, which I mentioned earlier, defines homeless youth as individuals who lack a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. Additionally, the National Coalition for the Homeless identify these youth as being under the age of 18 and lacking parental, foster, or institutional care. They may also be termed runaway youth or thrown out youth. There is no specific definition of runaway youth, but in Georgia, it could be classified as an unruly child. Under Georgia state law, an unruly child means, among other things, a child who, without consent of his or her guardian, deserts his or her home. And many don't like that term unruly because it becomes exclusive and extremely judgmental. The labels and definitions conflict, but I think we can all agree to say homeless youth lack stable and adequate living arrangements and have either little or no involvement with adults. We must find ways to protect the homeless youth. Nationally, there are laws that have been passed to do that. State to state, it can be different. It is challenging to service providers when it becomes complicated to provide the kids basic necessities of life. Because of the sometimes confusion in the law, many youth think that they may be turned away for services or have a fear that they may be taken into custody if they enter into a shelter. They lack legal status to live independently, and service providers and advocates struggle constantly with these issues. The National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty has done extensive research state to state regarding the laws affecting homeless youth. Their objective for 30 years has been to champion the needs of runaway, homeless, and disconnected youth. And they do this through advocacy, innovation, and services. And you can find their reports and information on their website, nnforyouth.org. And if you're interested, you can read more about what they study. It's very extensive. They reported on current law in 12 key areas that affect the lives and the future of unaccompanied homeless youth in all 50 states and the U.S. territories. They've also made recommendations for policy change within these reports. Always their main view is on strengthening the support for the youth. And who would have thought that laws that we create to protect young people could become controversial, but it can be. And that's why groups like the National Law Center on Homeless and Poverty and the research that they do is important for us to continue to protect this population of young people. And I would love to talk about the 12 key areas that they focus on in this report because they are all important, but it would take too long, and I don't think all of you want to listen to me for that long. But again, you can go on the website and look at the reports if it's of interest to you. I will discuss here some notable trends that are emphasized in the report. I talked about definitions earlier and how defining a problem is important in treating a problem. And in this case, also putting a number on just how many are affected is important. In the report under definitions, it talks about how 85% of the U.S. jurisdictions define a youth as under 18 years of age. Only 13% have defined them where they may exceed 18 years of age. New Jersey, for example, defines homeless youth as 21 years of age. And the report says it's a more noteworthy statute because it acknowledges that even older young people are in need of appropriate care and supervision. One may see how limiting an age and putting a number on a child may hinder what type of services and for how long services from state to state can be offered. Again, definitions here are very important. A few jurisdictions use judgmental language to define homeless youth, such as unruly, delinquent, and incorrigible. And as I mentioned earlier, Georgia does this. Another trend is in the punitive approaches to unaccompanied youth. The report mentions how prevalent it is in many jurisdictions. 86% of the jurisdictions allow youth to be taken into custody. 16% define running away as a truancy offense or a status offense, which means it's punishable. And 29% even say it's a crime to harbor a runaway without regard for reasons for youth leaving home. So you can see if you live in a community where if you harbor a runaway, it could be punishable, then you can see how the youth wouldn't seek out any kind of shelter opportunity. And it would limit what service providers can offer these youth. So important are the services to these youth, and many jurisdictions require a provision of their law to ensure that these children get health care and education even without parental consent. So this would include the kids being able to apply for basic health care, mental health care, alcohol and drug addiction treatments, all important services for these children. Many jurisdictions in the U.S. may legally obtain emancipation. The children may legally obtain emancipation, allowing them to live independently. 33 of these jurisdictions in the U.S. have established this process, but there are a lot of legal limits still, which require the youth to have parental consent, which does not make any sense. And the National Law Center recommends it throughout the country. They see this as a huge gap in providing freedom and self-sufficiency for these kids. So they recommend it throughout the country, but with safeguards to ensure that the youth are protected. Many states permit juvenile or family court to become involved with homeless youth and their families and refer them as needing supervision. There are different ways in which a state treats those who, quote, need supervision. The youth can be taken into custody by police and other government officials, or they may be provided services before or after a court proceeding. And in Georgia, we refer to these young people and their families as CHINS, child in need of services or child in need of supervision. In Georgia, runaway youth is classified as status offenders, meaning it can be punishable. As I said earlier, Georgia also classified truancy as status offenders. In my current placement, I work with families who have children who are chronically absent or tardy in school, and we make them aware that there's a compulsory attendance law here in Georgia that says if children miss more than 10 days of school, which are unexcused absences, then the parents could be fined or possibly imprisoned. So the AJC article I spoke of earlier also pointed out that you rarely see these homeless youth hanging out in a soup kitchen because they're trying to stay away from the very population that has put them on the street. They don't trust adults. There's every pimp, pedophile, and sex trafficker just waiting to exploit them. So the service providers have a great challenge reaching out to these kids and finding ways to gain their trust. There are many of them here providing services in Atlanta that work with the homeless, runaway, and trafficked youth. And these youth need to know that there are places that they can go to get help, the places that protect them, places that can empower them, and ultimately help them to achieve self-sufficiency and success in adulthood. Most of these agencies offer programs and services beyond the basic food, clothing, and shelter. There is street outreach, going directly to those living on the streets. Some provide community outreach services, immediate sanctuary or shelter from those that are abusing them, emergency situations, individual and group therapy, recreational therapy, life skill classes, independent living classes, SAT prep, GED classes, college prep classes, and there's even vocational training and support for these kids. So there's a lot of different programs here in Atlanta, and I'm showing you some of them. They're all very familiar names to all of us, all doing really good work. Federally, homeless youth living in a shelter or on their own should be able to apply for food stamps. Their parents' income is not calculated in when trying to receive their benefits. So this is something that many homeless youth try to turn to, but many of them aren't even aware that they're offered it. And the Recovery Act of 2009 on the federal level helped a lot of families, and there was money put here into Georgia for emergency assistance and helped many homeless people here in Georgia. It combined the TANF, which we have learned about in our class, emergency funds, and the HPRR, which is the Homeless Prevention Rapid Rehousing Fund. So it's saying that TANF and the HPRR could be used together to increase resources for families in these emergency situations. But it's really hard for me to find data on whether the homeless youth directly benefited from this money. And apparently there was $1.5 billion nationally allocated for this specifically for the homeless population. I do know Georgia received some funds, but like I said, it's really hard to find out whether the population of the homeless youth benefited from any of this money, federal money, directly. So I'd like to leave you with the worldview on the numbers of children who are homeless, because it's quite staggering. In the cities around the world today, they're filled with up to 100 million street children. And most of them are living in the poorest of conditions. These are slum settlements. There is no water. There are no toilets. There is no garbage collection. There is no heat. There is no air conditioning. There is no electricity. So we're talking about kids living in the poorest of conditions in the world. 100 million street children. Brazil seems to have the greatest number within their continent, with up to 8 million. And they say there's even 800,000 children who are suffering in prostitution in Brazil. In the children in Brazil, the ones that they've surveyed say that they expect to be killed by the time that they are 18. So there is completely no hope in their eyes for any kind of future. In Asia Pacific region, the numbers are at around 25 million children living on the streets. In India, there's about 18 million. In all of Africa, they say there's probably around 32 million children who are homeless. So all these numbers are very unsettling. And there's an article that I read from this publication called The Fair Observer, which addresses this staggering number of street kids in the world. And the author, Carl Gilland Halverson, if I say his name correctly, wrote a really wonderful piece in October 2014, so very recent, on his perspective after interviewing many of these vulnerable youth. And I suggest you read it if you have the time, and I'll post a link on our Google group here as well, so you can access it easily. And he does a wonderful comparison between the U.S. homeless problem in the world. And we are so different than a lot of these poor third world nations. But what he tells us is the impact on the future of our countries is so equal, because it's how we react as a nation to the problem. And we must value our youth if we are to be successful as nations. And he says this, I'll just give you a quick little, I'll leave you with a quick little quote from him. And he says, whether homeless young adults reside in the industrialized or the developing world, they are a concern to their societies. Violence, criminal activity, and health problems are all associated with large poverty-stricken communities. However, not every country responds with compassion. And that word, compassion, really struck me, because as social workers, I think we need to help be those compassion builders. So thank you for your time, and good luck with the rest of your semester, everyone.